Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles.
Dear listeners, before we get started, drop a quick hi in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you have any suggestions for us to make the channel better, please let us know. Now let's start with the story. I was born and raised on a pork and dairy farm just outside of town, so small the IRS had to try 3 times to locate it. The directions to the farm always started with, once you leave the blacktop. In 1970, just across the state line into Virginia, a lot was happening, but Mom and Pop didn't pay much attention to anything outside the county except for commodity prices. That was also the year I was born. Name's Harold Turner. I learned a lot from watching my dad and Uncle Walt fix whatever on the farm needed fixing. By the time I got to high school in Beverly Springs, I could milk cows, plow fields, frame and install doors and windows, wire grounded circuits to breaker boxes, rebuild lawn mowers, blow stumps with a quarter stick, hunt deer, butcher animals, and prep the meat for the smokehouse. Laundry wasn't my thing, but I pitched in with the vegetable garden and canning whenever I could. My brothers and I were deadly with our .22 rifles, keeping rats out of the corn cribs and critters away from the garden. We hunted for meat, too. I graduated high school a couple years early and scored high on the SAT, which earned me a full ride to West Virginia University in Morgantown, mostly thanks to my math scores. I'd always tested well. In the fall of 1985, I drove into Morgantown in my 1938 Chevy stake bed pickup. It looked rough, but I had taken it apart down to the frame and rebuilt it. In the back was a footlocker with my clothes and my toolboxes. I was towing a rebuilt single-axle diesel-powered Lincoln welder. I wasn't some idealistic kid, I was a farm boy ready to take hold of what was mine and fight for it. My first 2 weeks at school were spent taking CLEP tests, which covered my math up through calculus and statistics, plus 3 semesters of Spanish and 2 English courses. For one English class I couldn't dodge, I started a journal. I dove deep into electronics and the science behind electromagnetic waves, whether through wires or over the air. I earned extra money welding for the campus maintenance crew and the agronomy department, which taught city kids how to handle tractors and farm gear safely. I also took enough education courses for a minor, following the idea that teachers and garbage collectors are the last people you want to lose no matter how rough things get. There's always a job somewhere. I tried to hook up with a few pretty girls, but when they found out I wasn't a party boy, I got dropped like a hot rock. It depressed me for a while. Then I figured out that they were after good times and a free ride. They never had made good wife material. They were stuck mentally as teenagers. Some folk never grow up. I tucked in my chin and left it all behind like a fart in a windstorm. Late one night, I got to wondering why a specific FET transistor cascade acted the way it did. It had a second, higher power plateau. It wouldn't leave me alone, and by the time I figured out what was happening, I had a Ph.D. and a patent. A few more ideas later followed by a few more patents, and they kicked me off the campus with an MS degree in electrical engineering and minors in math and education. That was all right with me. Collegiate bureaucracy didn't agree with my disposition. It made me want to punch people or test an axe handle to destruction. It was the spring of 1992 that I drove back to the farm to help out. Mom and Dad had a lot more gray hair and moved a lot slower. Uncle Walt had a run-in with a plow and lost. He was living in town in a nursing home. He'd never walk again. Once I came back, I made sure that he made it to the table for Sunday dinners. He bitched a lot about it, but I could tell that he appreciated getting out of that place regularly, just by watching his face. Despite my patent annuities, I wanted to increase my income, and working on the farm just wasn't doing it. Brother Tom wanted no part of farming. He didn't want to work that hard for a living. I talked it over with Mom and Pop. They knew that the day was coming, but agonized over it nonetheless. The farm had provided them with honest-to-God living wages and provided for bringing up 3 boys for nearly half a century. However, the economy of farming had shifted to benefit the big factory farms. Just as the majority of the family-owned corner groceries, narcotic stores, butcher shops, and hardware stores had folded because the chain stores had buying power that they had no chance of matching. They were fractionally nickeled and dimed to death. People writing the news said that it was just the passing of an age, but they were murdered by way of cold, calculated economic warfare nonetheless. The farm was sold to a grain combine, which meant that at least the land would be kept in production and not paved over for housing developments. With the price of productive land being so high, the farm sold for over $4 million. Mom and Dad took $500,000 to retire on. Uncle Walt took $400,000 out of the kitty and moved in with them, along with a full-time nurse in a nice house way down south in Hillsboro, where the winter wasn't quite so unpredictable. The family insisted that since my brother and I were the only ones that needed a gripstick to grow with, we split the rest. Jim had died in the sandbox, despite his being the best shot of all 3 of us. A roadside bomb blew his, but to flinders. Brother Tom was happy just pulling down a paycheck and banked his half for bad times. To tell you the truth, I think he was the smartest of all of us despite working as a grease monkey in an antique restoration shop. Once the tax man savaged us like a rabid dog, Tom and I were each left with $925.00 and a bad case of shell shock. I talked my brother into investing in a small fluid fund with a good ROI and sticking the rest into long-term futures investments in rare earth elements that were necessary for sophisticated electronics. I followed them south in case one of them took a spill and needed some help. Tom moved to Charleston to follow the demand. Would you think that I could find a decent job around Hillsborough that didn't involve cleaning hotel rooms or the fast food industry? Hell no. I fell back on my education minor and applied at the local district. They needed a math teacher and a basketball coach. Like I knew shit about basketball. Right away, I worked my way into teaching industrial arts, drafting, and building trades. An anonymous donor ahem funded a CADCM lab, a CNC lathe, and a reconditioned 3D CNC milling machine. It didn't take long before we started turning out kids, male and female, that could walk right into jobs fresh out of school. Over the summers, the first brushed up on my welding and got a few industry certs, refreshed my CADCM certs, and did repair work for a local sawmill. The next year, I added a high-pressure water cutting table to the school shop. It was simple to integrate into the CAD lab with the vendor's code libraries. It was about 1998 that the equipment needed refurbishing. Being the short-sighted sons of bitches that they were, the entire program was scrapped and the equipment was sold off for 10% of its market value rather than invest any money in updating the equipment that would benefit the students without any payoff for the teachers. What a great union. What great benefits, Seth. All that left a bad taste in my mouth that wouldn't quit. I was deeply pissed. Rather than get my hands dirty, I cashed in some of my investments and had the union officials investigated down to a level rarely pursued short of a military security check or a vetting by the Secret Service. A college student with a hair up his butt agreed to break into the paste-up server for a daily DC newspaper to disseminate the officials' records, then carefully prune the server's access logs of any incriminating entries. Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky mining folk don't take well to people wearing suits screwing with their kids' educations. Admittedly, a lot of relatively innocent teachers' union officials got tarred with the same brush. Soon there was a deep void where the union representation used to be. A few state representatives and senators disappeared as well. Quite a few people at the NEA quit over personal health issues. The DC police were confounded over the number of bodies found floating in roadside ditches across the county. A damning picture was drawn after the employment histories of the deceased were compiled, one pointing at payola and educational markets and their special interest groups. I figured that it was about time to get out of the business before some righteous warrior with a 6th grade diploma decided to burn me at the stake for my hand in matters. I'd spent the last 4 summers working at a local sawmill. I talked the manager into taking me on full-time. The income was a lot better than teaching ever paid. I didn't have to grade any papers at night, and I didn't have to deal with nearly as many idiots. It was a good gig while it lasted. After 3 years, Manny had to pull the plug. He'd been running at a deficit for a few years and didn't see the industry picking up for the plywood and custom wood market that close to DC. I tried to turn him onto the specialty woods marine market, but it just didn't work out. I had enough cash in the bank to prepare for a project I'd been thinking about. I talked Manny into a one-shot contract with me before he declared bankruptcy. I had him buy several railroad flat cars of seasoned logs and mill them into 3-side flat 10 by 10 beams, leaving the last side naturally curved. I had them cut to 12-foot, 16-foot, and 24-foot lengths, then mill out as many 2-inch thick planks as he could from the cutoffs, and the final half car full of logs. All the logs were then run through the big bandsaw to cut 10-inch deep lap joints at the end of each beam, then drill a 1-inch hole through the middle of each face. I paid him 30% over cost, in cash. Both of us knew that he'd never report a penny of it. All that tax-free cash would give him a cushion to live off of until he got back on his feet. After he declared bankruptcy and went Chapter 11, I bought a few things from the business: a big Ford tractor with a front-end loader and a backhoe attachment, a pair of forks that would fit on the front-end loader's bucket to move logs or pallets, an 18-foot hydraulic gantry crane, a couple hundred feet of almost new 1-inch chain, and a big box of chain hooks. It cost me a pretty penny to lease a warehouse and have the timber and equipment trucked to it to be stored until I could buy a suitable plot of land. Back in the 40s and 50s, the government sold forested plots in the Smokies to returning veterans with the right of first refusal written into the contracts. It was a policy that, with a few changes, went back to the land grants of the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Most of the eastern properties had been bought back by the National Park Service, but a few were still out there. At that time, the Forestry and National Park Services were so strapped for cash that they didn't have the budgets to redeem the park properties. I had caught a whisper of a rumor of a property coming up on the market to be sold at auction for back taxes. I knew that once it hit the auction block, the price would skyrocket. I spent some good money working through the county land registers in eastern West Virginia until I found a plot that matched what I'd heard about, up around Bardo. Rather than wait until the sheriff was notified to force an auction, I undercut the process by offering a certified check to pay for the back taxes and the fees demanded to unencumber the property deed from the estate. It cost me almost $130,000 to get that deed transferred to my name, free and clear. Not bad for 36 acres of uncut timber and the land under it in the middle of a national forest. The deed explicitly stated that it was serviced by a fire road that was to be kept up by the county. The first spring, 2003. At the ripe old age of 33, I began implementing my long-planned retirement. It was a good thing that my old stake-side truck had an exceptionally high clearance. That excuse for a fire road was nothing but ruts, cuts, washouts, pits, and voids. I could have lost an Abrams tank to that thing. It hadn't been looked at, much less worked on in over 8 years, and 8 years of mountain weather had pretty much returned it to its natural state. It took a state-level court order to get it returned to something that a car could navigate. It still took the county a year and a half to blast the big stones into manageable size, fill in the voids with broken limestone, lay down culverts, clean up the roadbed with a bulldozer, clear out the ditches, and top it all with 20 inches of crushed limestone. I contracted with a civil engineering company to drive corrugated retention walls in on either side of the road for the 2 miles needed to get to my gate. Then I had them rebuild the driveway to the old home site, almost a mile further into the property. All that was left of the homestead was a standing fireplace and chimney at one end of a big square of foundation rocks. Nobody had been out to visit the property in over a generation. An aerial survey found several collapsed buildings and half a dozen carcasses of cars and trucks. I had all the metal roofs and auto wrecks hauled out by helicopter and disposed of. The survey showed that there was no flat land larger than a large glade anywhere on the property. How could I afford all this? Unlike what I'd suggested to my brother, after a couple years I split my funds into half and half, long-term commodities and short-term investments. My talent for math hadn't let me down as I'd been a fairly successful day trader over the years. Rather than build a cabin myself, I had more than enough in the bank to afford to have it built for me. I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted and how I wanted it built. Still, I hired an architect to put his stamp of approval on my plans because he knew the local building codes. The fourth spring, 2005. The old homestead wasn't situated the best it could have been. When the dirt dried enough to work with, I had the engineers flatten out a 240-foot-long terrace some 60 feet wide and 35 feet up from the bottom of the draw behind the homestead, backing onto Rattlesnake Run. All the pulled-down trees and their root balls were piled up for later processing, and retention walls were driven in on both the high and low sides of the terrace. While the dirt was being moved into place, I had it run through a landscaper's rock sieve and the stones piled into a rock fence at the downward edge of the new plateau. At the rear of the terrace, furthest from the driveway, I had a 30-foot deep by 50-foot wide corrugated brown pole barn built, facing the rest of the terrace. It wasn't any great shakes to have a single-lane crushed limestone road next to the high-side retaining wall filled to about a foot above level grade, then curbed with landscaping timbers. The pole barn was floored with tamped, crushed limestone, then topped with a little sharp sand, just like the turning basin between the pole barn and the cabin site. The water table was fairly high and there wasn't any hard pan, so getting a good well dug wasn't as expensive as it could have been. Next, a big 2,000-pound propane tank got dropped off next to the pole barn and filled. I had a concrete pad put in and a filled cinder block shed put in near the propane tank, then bought a fairly large Generac for it, as my old Lincoln welder had long ago expired past the point of economical repair. I had heat, lights, and electricity inside my pole barn. I completed the facilities with an elevated water tank mounted up in the rafters connected to a hot water heater. I knocked together a frame, then welded up a grid of half-inch rebar for a workshop floor, then called in an order for 2 big ready-mix trucks to pour a 12-inch thick slab 10 feet by 30 off to one side of the big sliding door. Once the concrete hardened, I had my shop floor that was stable enough to support a milling machine. It was getting on towards late summer. I had my plans saved in an AutoCAD.dxf, so it wasn't much trouble to get prints made. I submitted them to the county along with the architect's approval. I'd taught building trades for long enough that I'd about digested the construction code book, so I knew what I could get away with and what I couldn't. Unlike most homes in the area, I specified a full basement in the plans. A 24 by 42-foot log cabin built of 10 by 10 beams with 1-inch threaded rod bolted through the joints linking the foundation, and the cap rails exceeded the building code so far that there wasn't any room for them to squirm. I planned on 4 thick Thermax interior wall panels and 12-volt electrical circuit runs. Anything requiring 120 volts would be relegated to the pole barn, some 30 feet away, next to the generator to avoid line loss. The prints even specified an 800-gallon fiberglass-lined septic vault. The only break in the cabin's thermal barrier was a provision for a Franklin wood-burning stove in an ingle nook next to a sauna enclosure, which was next to the master bedroom, all under a half ceiling. The kitchen was placed on the other side of the ingle nook with a full bathroom between them. The plans showed a shed roof tapering off towards the back. The cabin was placed to cut across the plateau, just leaving road access back to the pole barn for servicing the septic vaults and propane tank coming in, and allowing the tractor and implements access to the field between the front of the cabin and the driveway. The ceiling tapered down from 24 feet at the south side, or front, which faced the field, to 18 feet at the north, or rear. There was plenty of room for a half-second floor, keeping the taller half uninterrupted for a high-ceiling vault. I'd planned on thermopane windows on both levels and several wrought iron chandeliers to eliminate dark voids. The first-floor bathroom shared a wall with the kitchen to centralize service distribution. I made sure that a big multi-paned window lit up the kitchen sink and countertop that looked out over part of the yard between the cabin and the pole barn with a good view up the valley. The county commissioner approved my building plan. However, it was too late in the year to get the cabin in the dry, sealed up. After my contractor got the full basement dug and a septic tank buried next to the pole barn, everything was mothballed for the winter. I had the tractor and bucket as well as the gantry crane and a couple loads of beams and planks that I'd bought from Manny transported to my job site. Regrettably, everything that I had in storage wouldn't fit, so I had to pay the lease on the old warehouse and pay for its insurance for another year. I knew that I'd get cabin fever, so I bought a chainsaw, a 50-gallon tank of gas up on a dispensing rack, a 250-gallon tank of diesel up on a rack, and plenty of oil for the chainsaw. Never buy a chainsaw without buying new, sharp files, and a sharpening jig unless you've already got one. I also bought a single-axle 8 by 10-foot cart and a smaller 4 by 6-foot cart to tow behind the tractor. What's a farmer do when he's bored? Walk a fence line or cut firewood. Since I didn't have any barbed wire fence, it was cut firewood. Throughout the winter, I tore down and rebuilt that tractor to get the most life I could out of it. All the hydraulic hoses were replaced because the thing had been stored out in the weather while Manny owned it, and the hoses degrade faster under sunlight. I bought a cheap little vacation trailer to live in over the winter. A little work with some sheet tin and pop rivets piped all the exhaust gases out of a wall vent. A propane-fired refrigerator and freezer stored on my shop floor gave me some flexibility. I made sure that my pump head and water lines were insulated, then picked up plenty of food to last until ice out. Once the road closed down, I wouldn't see hide nor hair of a snow plow or sand truck until spring. I was some 4,900 feet above the nearest town. I bought plenty of canned meat, canned vegetables, and canned fruit to live on, then added baking supplies and a few 50-pound bags of potatoes to the larder. I had a stacking washer/dryer put in for a couple $100 to take care of my sanitation that winter. With a load of steel and welding rod I framed in my shop so that I could work in the cold, then built my shop tables. I laid it out for woodworking as well as heavy repair and steel fabrication. I intended to build some shelves for the main cabin, the basement, and the shop. I had yet to plan out what to do with the loft. As the winter progressed, the disorganization about drove me to distraction. I swore that I was going to have a root cellar dug come hell or high water. I built several sets of shelves out of welded angle iron and topped them with slab lumber in an attempt to get a hand on my inventory, but Murphy had already settled in for the winter. It helped some, though. I parted together a table and chair to eat and read at, as that little trailer was pretty claustrophobic after about the 5th week. I was surprised that I'd held out that long. Still, it gave me a warm place to cook, shower, and sleep, all the real necessities, once you come down to it. The weather broke in mid-January long enough for me to get to a lumber yard and pick up some heavy plywood, construction adhesive, paint and painting supplies, and a few fluorescent light bays. I built the walls and ceiling for my shop with space for my 12-foot gantry crane to roll around. The light bays were recessed into the plywood sheathing. I had plenty of space to work in so as not to get claustrophobic while working inside the bay. Every day that it didn't rain, I cut firewood out of the piled-up trees that came out when the terrace was sculpted. I reserved a few longer trunks to make storage ricks under the front porch roof. It wasn't the best dried firewood, but it had been uprooted over 6 months before. I saved out the big pile of tops to run through a chipper, then spread out and cultivate in for my vegetable garden. I saved out the root balls for burning over long winter's nights while I lay on one of my Inglenook benches with a quilt. The 5th spring, 2006. The permits flew like flower petals. The county commissioners had never seen this type of architecture built before and were anxious to see it executed. Jamie, my contractor, hadn't worked with it either, but permanent insulated concrete forms attached to a continuous footer were simple to implement. Most of the custom work went into the half-inch steel toe rails that were threaded onto and locked into the foundation, while the joist hangers were bolted in place. The interior and exterior wall beams were dropped in place by crane, then the welded cap rails were bolted onto the 1-inch threaded rod that ran through the lap joints wherever the beams joined. A bit of trickery was involved with setting in sections of the beams to form gables. Slow-setting construction adhesive filled all the voids and sealed the seams between the beams. The windows and doors were hung, then a 4-inch thick Thermax panel lining was applied to all the walls, inside and out. There were a few post-in beam features built in for visual appeal, both to define spaces under the second floor and to break up the big unrelieved space of the tall wall. It went up damned fast with the help of a skilled crane operator. Heavy structural beam floor joists were laid in while the crane could access the interior, then covered by the heavy 2-inch thick planks and secured with dock screws. A pair of custom-cut 10 by 10 beams that ran down the center of the length of the cabin were prepared with chisel work to receive the beams, making up the ceiling joists, and more planks were laid across them for the second floor flooring. Openings were cut and ramps were run to provide access from the basement up to the second floor, both of which ran across the east wall, which faced the hillside. Then the long railing was brought in and anchored so nobody would take a header off of the second floor. A flying beam was installed high up in the vault to support the chandeliers, which were controlled by 4 independent wall cranks. The roof trusses were bolted to the cap rails, and 1-inch marine plywood was screwed down to the trusses. The roofing felt went down with standard nails, then the crane was used to hoist pallets of traditional concrete shingles up, which were screwed down to the underlayment. The last heavy job that needed the crane was to drop in the dark, heavy recycled plastic faux timber support poles for the carport. The poles were concreted in place so that the roof line at the cabin side was 12 feet high, stretching out 12 feet to a roof line of 8 feet. The whole thing was as wide as the cabin was at 42 feet, leaving room for a porch on one side that protected the doorway and a big dry space to stack firewood on the other with room for a couple vehicles to park in the center. I intended to eventually screen in the porch, but I didn't have a timetable for it. By midsummer the shell was in the dry. The services were run in and terminated. It was then ready for me to take over. While doing the final site cleanup, my contractor brought out a tree chipper for me so that I could shred that big pile of tops I'd been sitting on since early winter. It made a huge pile of rough mulch that I covered with visqueen to help promote decomposition. I brought in a big tow-behind 220-volt generator and a big honkin' walking belt sander to smooth out the floors. I had 4 industrial fans going and wore an air mask while I worked. After blowing out all the sawdust with a high-pressure line, then wiping down all the inside surfaces with damp cloths and a cherry picker, I stained and varnished the floors, then varnished them again with polyurethane. The voids between the planks were routed out and filled with slightly resilient black construction adhesive. It looked like a teak floor by the time I finished. I knew enough not to try to decorate the place on my own, or it'd look like where flea markets went to die. Before I made any decisions, I went to the nearest largest library in Lewisburg. Rennick was where my closest Home Depot was, but the library sucked rocks. Before I left the cabin, I took a panoramic set of photos of both the interior and exterior. Then I packed a suitcase and found a hotel room as close as I could get to the Lewisburg main library. For a while there, I thought that the folks at the Hampton Inn was going to make me park my poor truck a couple blocks south at the Walmart. I found that I liked the shaker style a lot, edging out arts and crafts by a bit. I let my fingers do the walking, remember that advertisement for AT&T information, and found a decorator in Lexington, Virginia. They agreed to send out someone to meet me in Rennick, someone that was willing to work in reproduction shaker furniture. I made sure to let them know the person coming out should be wearing rough clothes and sturdy shoes. Carol was a big Hausenfrau that seemed to take over a room as she walked into it. She had curly gray hair and piercing blue eyes. We shook hands and piled into my truck. Rather than look at it as if she'd catch a disease, she seemed to approve of the rebuilt antique being used as it was designed for. When we turned off of the blacktop and onto the rougher fire road, she casually latched onto the Jesus strap. As came around the bend that exposed the view over the terrace to the cabin, she sighed. Very nice. If it weren't for the giveaway of the retention wall, this might have been here for a century. I taught building trades for a few years and designed the place myself. I'll show you the CAD prints. When we parked under the car porch, she remarked, "This begs for a light on a motion sensor." I preceded her through the door and flipped on the lights for the chandeliers. I hear her gasp as she caught sight of the open space below and above. She quickly removed a pair of short tripods, an electronic rangefinder, and a small, high-end camera from her beach bag-sized purse and took several shots from all 3 floors. She was done measuring and recording colors within 45 minutes. Back in town, we found a quiet table in a diner to discuss my expectations over brunch. The best use of the upper space seemed to be a pair of suites or kitchenless apartments when she brought up the subject of eventually hiring a cook or a maid. I wasn't getting any younger. 2 of the windows would have to be replaced with units designed for emergency egress and the use of emergency chain ladders to comply with national code. My having installed ramps instead of stairs made it inexpensive to make the apartments ADA compliant if a climbing rack were attached to the wall 2 feet above the ramp surface. A carabiner attached to a drop-down arm to latch onto a wheelchair frame would do the job nicely. Late that fall, I bought a plow, a rotary tiller, and a seeder for the tractor. I bought used where I could. Thinking matters over, I also bought a manure spreader and a high-pressure steam cleaner. I spent some time giving them tender, loving care over the rainy winter months. The 6th spring, 2007. I got damn tired of looking at all those weeds between my garden rows. Never get an inventor frustrated. I spent some money getting a basement electronics lab together. The industry had focused on shorter and shorter wavelengths in LED lasers. I went in the opposite direction. The microwave spectrum is quite broad, and frequencies can be carefully tuned to excite organic molecules until they cleave at their bonds. I had 3 goals to work towards. 1. Design, build, and debug a microwave maser emitter that transmitted in a band that excited chlorophyll molecules. 2. Expanding the beam face of the emitter to something like 20 centimeters by 2 centimeters. 3. Boosting the power. My design target was a 500 kilowatt per square centimeter continuous wave maser. I immediately had to compromise with pulsed emission because I didn't have the power supply that could cope with that power requirement, and the waste heat kept frying my emitters until I hit on using a grid of small tubes filled with circulating cryogenic CO2. Liquid nitrogen would have had a much better caloric transfer, but I couldn't easily make it. CO2 was no problem. It's the bootstrap process for all modern cryogenics. It killed plants, all right. The emission corona around the maser cooked everything green and downrange within a 20-degree cone a quarter-mile downrange. It took some waveguide work to clean up that behavior. Then I cast a reinforced concrete beam at one end of my garden rows with 2 pins corresponding to the centers between the rows. I made sure that it went down far enough so that it wouldn't shift over the winter. The microwave gun dropped down over the pins slick as you please. 1 quick zap, and the weeds between those 2 rows were gone to weedy heaven. A quick pass with a garden rake proved that dead weeds still had strong stems. Crap. I then built another device that would have a very narrow emitter and the maser-excited cellulose molecules. When I fired it up, the plants visibly jumped as the stalks exploded and collapsed. Cool. I had to buy a second big propane tank to power my toys and keep myself in cryogenic CO2. I slowly ran the cellulose destroyer across the hillside across from me, where I'd accidentally killed all the plants. I did it over time in horizontal bands to keep erosion from scalping the hillside bald. I built it like a rifle with a long umbilicus for the power and CO2 feeds. I firmly had the bit between my teeth. I remembered seeing a YouTube clip on lasers killing mosquitoes on the fly. I wondered what kind of discriminator it would take, and if it would even work in a real-world application without frying the retinas of anyone around. I went for the shotgun approach. After suitable research, I found that insects don't use hemoglobin. Their oxygen transport is tied up in some sort of homodimer exchange process. Once I isolated the resonant frequency, all I had to do was wave the powered emitter around and watch all the insects fall like nasty little winged demons. It didn't penetrate the soil worth a damn, so the worms and beneficial bugs beneath the surface weren't harmed. It had the additional benefit of impacting the fungi and bacteria in the garden as well. The only bad news was all the bats moved down into the valley where the bugs still lived. Bats gotta eat, and they follow their food. Since I had the pesticide-free farming bit down pat, I sent away for some apple, pear, and cherry saplings to plant along the edge of the plateau, just within the rock fence. I was watching with dismay as my bank balance dipped lower and lower. It was time to submit a few new patents. One was for insect abatement to break known disease transmission paths. One was for killing zebra mussels. A pulsed high-amplitude acoustic shellcracker was pretty easy to piece together once I got a few samples to work with. One was for electrically killing invasive plants along railway embankments and roadbeds, a kudzu killer. And another was for an electrical process for fractionally or totally degrading cellulose in controlled factory conditions. I figured that my income was assured. Cellulose-based cloth was coming on strong in the market, and this would considerably reduce the raw material prep time. I ate more fresh, pesticide-free melon and sweet corn than was healthy. My tomatoes came in like gangbusters, as did my lettuces, radishes, and root crops. I'd scaled my vegetable garden to be too large by at least a factor of 4. The only manual labor involved in my gardening was training the vines to climb trellises and the harvesting. I was spoiled. That fall the wasps started driving me crazy. They were everywhere. I couldn't sit out on my porch and enjoy a sunset without getting dive-bombed. Back to the library for more research. Answer: permethrin, 38.6% veterinarian grade. I ordered a half-gallon, a pump sprayer, and a pesticide-proof breathing mask. I sprayed under all the overhangs where they met the walls, except for that real high bastard at the top of the shed roof, and covered the inside of the carport roof. I did the same thing to the pole barn. I took the decorator's advice and installed a few box lights in the porch up under the eaves and one near the door on a motion detector. That one drove me crazy until I mounted it in a 3-sided box with no bottom that pointed at the carport. Then I could walk around inside my porch without getting flashed. The permethrin had the added benefit of chasing away helgramites, ants, biting flies, mosquitoes, termites, and chiggers. I had to respray once each spring and once each early fall. I bought a big Lodge cast iron hibachi and a couple Adirondack chairs so that I could sit back and enjoy the evenings with a little fire, even if the weather was disagreeable. It was quite pleasant. Many small pieces of beef were cooked out there that fall and winter. The 7th spring, 2008. I rented a big fence post drill for the tractor and started in planting tree saplings. From the sound of things, I had several clans of uninvited guests, cottonmouths, and rattlesnakes that'd take up residence in that rock wall. Now, there wasn't room enough on that homestead for all of us, and I had the technological upper hand. Back in the lab, I put together a very, very dangerous microwave emitter. Its dominant frequency and first harmonic would destroy hemoglobin. I sent away for metal mesh overalls with a metallized dome helmet and a backpack air compressor. I loaded the hemoglobin killer up on the tractor's cart, got dressed in my microwave-proof suit, fired it up, and slowly drove down the fence line. After I powered it off, I broke it down and put the parts on a shelf with good labels. The fence line was pretty stinky for a few weeks. I put the thing back together twice a year to make sure no more snakes moved in, then broke it down again each time. I got it in my head once more that I wanted a root cellar. Now, by all accounts, the best root cellar is a nice, cool cave. Since I'd essentially walled myself off from digging a root cellar anywhere close by having the terrace berm wall installed, I figured that the best person to work around my problem was the civil engineer that put up the retention wall to begin with. After describing my problem, he thought for a while, then said he had just the answer for me. We made an appointment for him to come out and show me a new product on the market that had impressed the hell out of him. He drove up in a semi hauling a flatbed covered in what looked like gigantic Legos. According to him, they usually came in 2-foot by 4-foot blocks, but some genius had ordered a batch of 4-foot by 16-foot shells that nobody could get rid of. My contractor had bought them for pennies on the dollar. He knew that my driveway could bear the weight as he'd installed it. So removing a retention wall panel, digging out the area required, poured a heavy foundation slab, and stacked the concrete-filled frames with plenty of construction adhesive. It would give me a root cellar that could quite possibly survive a hit from a 500-pound bomb. I agreed to the deal on the spot. He planned on a pair of heavy doors with an 8-foot tunnel between them, 4 feet wide. The place was a circus of ready-mix trucks running back and forth for just over a week. Then a flatbed semi filled with skids of adhesive showed up. From the time that the foundation slab was judged set up well enough to take the load, it took 6 days to build the cellar, replace the retention wall, backfill over the cellar, and hang a pair of very heavy doors. The last few things done were to run a power line inside it for lights and bring in a team to rake up the construction evidence. The interior got a double dose of water barrier spray before he handed it over to me. Hell, I thought that it would take a month, and there I was with my thumb up my butt and no lumber to build my shelves. I called a couple local sawmills to get a good price on a flatbed's worth of kiln-dried 2 planks and 4x4 beams, then got ready to start a building frenzy. When the semi drove up, the forks hooked up to the tractor made a fine substitute for a forklift to get everything unloaded. Regrettably, the nice weather broke. I had to string up a big trucker's tarp over my work area while the rain poured down. I measured, cut, and drilled the beams to make my frames, then assembled them into 4-layer high shelves with a 6-inch paintbrush that I kept dunking in construction adhesive and plenty of big lag bolts. I put in vertical load-bearing joists every 4 feet to keep the planks from bowing under the weight of canned goods. The cellar was 8 feet deep, had an 8-foot ceiling, and was 24 feet wide. I filled the back wall with shelves 18 inches bottom to bottom. I really couldn't see running out of room unless a lot more people moved in. I used ear defenders while driving those lag bolts in with a huge electric bolt driver that I'd bought to replace the wheels on my tractor's attachments. I'd only seen air-powered ones at half the size in auto shops before. When the implement dealer showed me this one, I had to have it. You'd be crazy not to wear a kidney belt when operating one all day long, just like a jackhammer. My decorator came through with the goods around the 4th of July. I had no arguments with the furniture or the braided rugs. I thought that some of the paintings were kind of iffy, but they grew on me. I drew my line in the sand when they started bringing in pier mirrors, pots filled with dried weeds, and other house-beautiful crap. Nope, don't want it, and I ain't gonna pay for it. I was certain that she was convinced that I stopped her from completing the job, but damn it, I didn't need more crap to keep clean. When we finally stopped locking horns and I paid her off to go away, I walked in the front door and stood there with my hands on my hips. Yep, it was what I wanted. My eyes were drawn to the big open wall that led up to the ceiling vault. I kept the decorator from installing any bookshelves for a reason. I wanted to build them myself. It cost me an arm and a leg to get half a semi-load of furniture-grade, 12-inch wide, 1-inch thick, 8-foot-tall oak boards delivered. I did some preliminary work on the lumber, sizing, sanding, staining, and varnishing everything before I made the first cut. I bought special blades for my table saw to nearly eliminate chipping and tear-outs, then bought the largest biscuit cutter and matching biscuits I could find. I'd need them to glue up the back panels. The box frames were dovetailed together with several router bits, and rather than cut dados for the shelves to fit into the box frame, I drilled, glued, and pegged in supporting fillets. Since each bookshelf was 4 feet wide, I glued up a 2-inch thick center post with fillets to support the center of each shelf. To preserve my books, magazines, and journals, I faced each bookshelf with a pair of glass doors, anchored back-to-back at the center spine. It took me most of the winter to get all 6 bookcases completed. Then I spent a few weeks digging through my files, organizing everything and arranging them on the shelves. I almost had a bad accident because I didn't anchor the shelves to the cabin frame. A few dock screws took care of that little problem. I recessed the heads, shaved off a few flat pieces of the oak stock with a bandsaw, stained and varnished them, and glued them over the holes. There were 2 in each bookcase, so they looked like a regular decorative feature that I'd intended. That almost accident made me realize that being out there alone with no telephone wasn't the best idea I'd had. I signed up for a sat phone. It didn't cost much extra to get a satellite-based internet connection for my computer, so I added that service to my monthly budget. It was time to get some health insurance too. I recalled a phrase that went something like, "It's tough to fly like an eagle after you get sucked into a jet engine like a seagull." The 8th spring, 2009. Once my investment account hit 1.3 million and my liquid assets exceeded 1 million, it sort of sunk in that I didn't have to scramble for money anymore. I estimated that soon my cellulose patent would earn me more money than Dave Thomas of Wendy's fame, and without the expenses. Barron's magazine did a layout on me as an up-and-coming millionaire. Regrettably, it brought the 2-legged cockroaches out in droves. I switched my sat phone to transmit only and hired a service to filter through my post office box with the instruction that since my annuities had finally leveled up to make me independent, I had no reason to invest in anything else, and my charitable donations would never got to any solicitors because they raked a significant percentage off the top. I had to go as far as to have a chain-link fence installed at the front gate and have a motorized gate installed, much like an encoded garage opener. I posted some signs that read, "Danger no trespassing." High-powered Maser research and testing facility. It got me a visit from the county sheriff. I showed him the bald spot across the ravine from when the chlorophyll killer got loose. After that, he made a bunch of polite noises and got out of there as fast as he could pedal his little white bubblegum machine. There has been a long-running tradition south of the Mason-Dixon line of well-to-do families hiring widowed women to cook and clean house for them. I'd been brought up in that tradition and saw nothing wrong with it. I set about hiring a live-in cook and housekeeper. Since I lived in the back of the back and had no television reception worth a damn, and I figured that older retired ladies would want to watch their soap operas, I had a satellite TV dish and decoder installed that got the Richmond, Virginia local stations before I set out any advertisements. The only problem was, I was an unknown. If I'd have been a local doctor or professor, there wouldn't have been any problem, but as things were, I had to interview with my applicants as much as they interviewed with me. The fact that I'd grown up on a farm not too far distant pulled a lot of weight in my direction. After seeing the place and listening to my story, Carol decided to take a chance on me. She was a skinny, bird-like woman that didn't say much at first, but when I saw her smile at seeing her apartment, I had an idea that we'd get along. Since we were so far from town, 28 miles one way over some dubious roads, I bought her a 4x4 SUV to drive and covered a gas card, then set up a debit card for her household purchases with an initial balance of $30K behind it. I figured that if she was going to rip me off, I'd best find out at the beginning rather than get surprised later. Lynn liked to bake, which suited me just fine. We both liked barbecue, so my Weber got a workout. She didn't know what to make of me spending so much time reading and working in my basement electronics lab. I was sure she thought I was nuts. I ran around every day in Walls overalls, Red Wing boots, and plaid cotton work shirts. When she asked what I did, I said, make money, why? I continued to do a little day trading in companies that showed promise, but it wasn't my life's end-all and be-all. It was like making donations with a ROI. After my bad experience with the Hillsborough Area School District, I was hesitant to donate any funds in the area without some sort of cast-iron-for-use contract in place. The best thing I could come up with was a county infrastructure bond earmarked for rural county bridge and road maintenance. I decided to keep an eye on how the money was spent, and if it wasn't diverted, I'd write off the bond, taking my income tax credit that way. To fund my civil commitments, I screwed my morals to the sticking point and submitted another couple patents. These were for a method for either destroying the high-tech carried by a soldier in the field or for neutralizing an enemy force without damaging their equipment. The first one took a bit of work to implement. I found a set of characteristic frequencies that would shred the circuit board material of anything in production except for solid carbon fiber, and a couple specific substrates used in high-radiation environments, such as extra-atmospheric work or the sensor and control boards used in nuclear-based power generation plants. I developed another emitter that was more of a psychological weapon than anything else. It had a two-part composite frequency range. One destroyed cellulose. The other destroyed nylon. Imagine being a member of a crack infiltration team performing a stealthy probe on a crazy inventor's installation. A sub-millimeter radar got triggered. An emitter tower popped up from an underground hardpoint. It slewed around and powered up. Pow! Your underwear just explosively disintegrated as the cellulose molecules flash-burned everything they were protecting. While you were dancing around holding your sunburn, nuts, your uniform, belts, pouches, and boots melted. Your rifle stock turned to steaming, bubbling gloop and dripped on the ground, along with your helmet liner, your weapons magazines, and the straps holding on your enhanced vision binoculars. Your radio was history. What are you going to do? The tunnels were easy to install. They were made of 4-foot diameter sewer pipe segments. Late that fall and winter, I started research on high-density power storage media. I started with polymer batteries that could be folded and rolled up. The problem turned into a many-headed dragon. Some of the answers I stole from other research teams. A group in New Zealand came up with a low-temperature superconductor. It solved my high-amperage power transmission problem and the pinpoint heating issue. I personally designed a low-thickness fuel cell that worked at room temperature. Traditional fuel cells operated at 300 to 400 degrees centigrade. Another team figured out how to use a fiberglass mat made out of tubules to replenish the fuel cell, thus dramatically improving its power function. A colloid-based ion transport system was adopted from research into tooth decay and how teeth handled fast ion transfer in an equilibrious protein colloid. Of course, if the thing ever shorted out or took something like a rifle round, it would explode like an anti-tank mine. The 9th spring, 2010. When it all came together for me, I must admit I had a period of redneck. Hold my beer and watch this insanity after that. I ordered 4 electro-hydraulically controlled gimbal mounts for big super quiet duct fans, a few grand in oval titanium tubing, a motorcycle seat, and a used wind fairing, handlebars and front bearing assembly from a Honda Goldwing. I built myself an honest-to-God, Star Wars Forests of Endor flying speeder bike. Dumb shit me didn't even think about AGL control or collision avoidance radar. I've got a home movie showing a scene of this white-painted blur blasting past the camera's point of view with a strange, Dopplered screeching noise in the background. That was me running about 250 miles per hour at 15 feet above ground level. The noise was me screaming. I finally got the thing parked in front of the cabin. After I stopped shaking enough, I walked into the kitchen, shedding pieces of tree branches and bushes in my trail. Lynn took one look, put her fists on her hips, and said, "Harold, what the hell did you just do?" After a minute, I replied, "I just raised the bar for adrenaline junkies the world over. I got the power supply patented, then worked on the collision avoidance circuitry. Once I got the display unit integrated, which I bought from a sailboat navigation system, the thing was almost safe enough for a test pilot to try out. It looked kind of cool with that big white bubblegum radome sticking up over the driver's seat on a swept-back pylon. Then I added a roll cage. It was a blast to stun around in. It would even fly inverted. However, I didn't dare take the thing into town. After a nasty, sweating dream, I constructed a special flyer with a narrow-beam hemoglobin spectrum emitter mounted facing forward, collimated with a 5-watt green aiming laser. A thumb switch under a cover would fire it. I kept that beast plugged in and ready to go in the pole barn, under a tarp. The 10th spring, 2011. I pondered what to do with the plans. I came to the conclusion that only people with a death wish and a pockets deep enough to afford the power pack would try anything. So I published the hardware plans, the circuit schematics and photographs of the nacelle interior. I even published a component pick list along with current prices and contact addresses, both by paper mail and electronic. The thing was more agile than a jet copter, but didn't have the top end of anything currently in the military inventory. Anything with a jet engine could run one down, and they were vulnerable to missile fire. They were not radar stealthy on purpose. I'd missed out on how much people wanted to fly and the sheer devilment that people could get into. The damn things were everywhere within 6 months. At first, the news was full of the horror, showing bloody accident sites. If it bleeds, it leads, It wasn't too long before everyone became blasé about it, like Britney Spears going into rehab again. Governments tried to clamp down on them via strict licensing, but they were just too damned much fun. A guy with a welder and some 10% chrome steel pipe could make the frame, and there was thriving black market for the circuit boards. When I was in my cups, I told Lynn that it was a eugenic self-correcting device. It's what happened to that generation of explorers now that there wasn't any place on Earth left to explore that wasn't underwater. Of course, I denied it all the next morning. Money poured into my accounts from sales of the fuel cells. I was hearing some dirty little secrets around town. The cops were running a narcotic asset forfeiture scam. All they had to do was charge someone with owning or dealing in illegal narcotics, and virtually everything they owned disappeared into the county treasury. Well, all that didn't take a side trip into their pockets, that is. It was like jury acquittal. It was out there, but the government didn't want anyone to know about it. The scam hadn't been run just once or twice either, but over a dozen times. They were like an egg-eating dog out of control. I felt like a target, so I decided to harden my defenses. My first measure was by all appearances innocent. I had a cattle gate installed just inside my electrically controlled gate at the end of the driveway. A cattle gate is constructed of a half-dozen horizontal pipes buried at ground level, almost touching each other. Cattle won't walk on them because it crushes their hooves between the pipes. I dug out between alternate pipes and buried enough explosives to overturn a heavy truck in each of 2 sets of charges. I buried them in PVC pipes with a pressure detonator linked to the gate activation circuitry. If the gate cycled, then the bombs were put on safe. If someone crashed the gate, well, too bad for them. If the first 2 charges didn't dissuade them, I buried a much larger 3rd charge under the whole thing that I guaranteed would send a tank flying back down the road. 800 pounds of nitrate hexamine would leave a 3 to 4 meter wide pit in the driveway. As a nod towards keeping things legal, I had small dangling signs attached to the no trespassing alerts. They read, potentially lethal defenses in place. I had 2 poles with spinning amber lights mounted to the gate posts. The sign below read, defenses online when light is spinning. I got the idea from a visit to a government chemical warfare repository out west. The cabin door was replaced by something you'd see on a bunker, and all the windows were replaced by 8-layer bulletproof modules. I thought of one more layer of defense, but I really didn't want to deploy it. Using it would be premeditated murder. However, when I heard that the police had started shooting people down on their forfeiture raids, I acknowledged that raised the bar, not me. With Lynn's help driving the tractor, I ran some high-powered circuits and liquid nitrogen feeders to 2 points just under the eaves of all 4 walls, and one more right beside the front door light fixture. I mounted 9 hemoglobin resonators in lightweight weather protective shells. The other ends of the runs were fed down to the basement shop, where they were hooked to a big valved liquid nitrogen tank and an equally large pair of fuel cells. I stocked a couple cots, some bedding, jugged water, and a portable toilet down there. I explained to Lynn what might happen. If you hear explosions from out towards the gate and start to see guys acting like soldiers running towards the cabin, hit the basement and bolt the trap door. Then open the valve on the big nitrogen tank. Wait 2 seconds and turn the key under the flip-up cover next to it. Regrettably, there's no easy, secure way of finding out if they've gotten out of the woods and into the clearing yet. But if you take your time getting down the ramp and locking up behind you, most of them should be on the road next to the field or around the cabin. A 20-second shot should do the job. Turn the key to the left until it stops, then turn off the gas valve. If you feel brave, go back up and look through a window. If any of them are moving or more are coming down the road, do it all again. Remember, if you turn the key without the gas running, they'll overheat in just 5 seconds or so and burn out. Be as frugal as you can with the gas valve. Lynn nodded. She said in a low voice, "This is for all the marbles, isn't it?" I sighed. All the marbles. They're killing people on these faked-up narcotic raids. She stood taller, then pursed her lips and looked me in the eyes. That shit stops here. We were on the same frequency. The bank had no problem in my withdrawing $10,000 in cash. I had over $4 million on deposit, so they didn't give me any crap about it. I made sure that several people saw me stuff a fat envelope in my jacket pocket while walking down the sidewalk to the truck. It was my bait money. I accompanied Lynn into town for the next shopping trip. We went out of our way to visit a store across the Virginia line that she never used, and went quite early in the morning as they were a 24-hour operation. I bought a few filled 20 propane tanks and a 2-burner camper stove with an oven. We bought enough big plastic jugs to stockpile a couple hundred gallons of water in the basement. I already had a very illegal 500-pound propane tank down there plumbed to a generator. We had 3 cases of paper towels on the shelves that would serve perfectly well as toilet paper. We were stocked up for a short siege if it came to that. It really didn't take much to cut into the cabin's plumbing stack and hook up a shower, toilet, and dish sink just off the lab. It did need electricity to operate the effluent pump, though. In town, things were getting tense. A household a week was being taken down. None of the victims were white. There was a lot of sedition being talked in the local Baptist church. Things were coming to a head. Somebody that saw me come out the bank had a big mouth. That attracted attention to me like vermin to a bad Chinese restaurant. An operation was planned for Friday night. No sirens, no lights. 8 unmarked cars and 2 vans pulled up to the gate on the fire road. A sergeant read the warnings. "What the hell is this, Lawrence?" The captain said, "Shut up and ram the gate." "Just who is this guy anyway?" "He's a guy with a huge wad of money. Now shut up and do what I tell you." The sergeant backed up as far as he could across the road, tightened his seat belts, and gave it the gas. The fence was only made of cheap tubing and diamond mesh fencing. He went right through it with his bull bar front bumper. The first charge detonated under the rear axle, somersaulting the car onto its hood. It was the first time they'd come across any effective resistance. The entire team was shocked into immobility as Sergeant Evans crawled out of the shattered window, scratched up and very unhappy. Lawrence, the team lead, wasn't about to let any delays undermine his command authority. "Next car. Now that we've blown the gate defenses, we're in. Push the first car off to the side and continue like we planned." The second car didn't somersault. The charge blew under the engine block. That lifted the vehicle some 8 feet in the air. When it came down hard and destroyed the front-end suspension. The frame sat on the ground while the engine's antifreeze leaked out. It wasn't going anywhere fast. Lawrence said to himself, "Oh, what a cluster shit. Sidwell, Martinez, Carlson, get some ropes on those cars. Use a come-along and pull them out of the way. We're wasting time here, goddammit." Several more officers pitched in to get the job done. Soon the way was clear. The captain was driving the next vehicle in line, the first recovery van. He rolled across the gate's lower pole and onto the cattle guard. All hell broke loose. A 2-ton Chevy van is not an armored personnel carrier by any stretch of the imagination. The front end went flying in one direction, while the rear end flew beautifully back across the road and over the ditch, burying itself in the trees and forest ground cover. The captain was definitely a candidate for a closed coffin funeral. The rest of the seizure team were spooked as hell. They looked back and forth at each other while tightly holding their weapons in white-knuckled grips for self-assurance. They slowly began to advance, bypassing the pit in the road. None of them looked into the van's passenger compartment. They'd all responded to high-speed traffic fatality calls. They knew what they'd see. They bunched up as they walked, subconsciously trying to gain comfort and confidence from their partners. Humph. The ground shook. I said, "What the hell was that?" Then I remembered. Oh, it was the doorbell. "Lynn, time to head to the basement. Don't do anything rash yet. I'm going to wait for them to show up before I lock up and come down." "Okay, Harold." She calmly picked up the pot of stew by the bale with one hand and pulled the almost done biscuits out of the oven with the other before heading downstairs. Screw it. Dinner came first. Once downstairs, she fired up the oven to finish off the biscuits and located some plates. Dinner would be a little late and the biscuits were flat, but the stew would be good. Maybe she should drop the biscuits in the stew for dumplings and let the steam finish them off. I bolted the door and turned out the lights. I stayed low to peer out the bottom of a window, watching the invaders slowly make their way towards the cabin. I waited until I heard one of them pound on the door before I skedaddled down the ramp and bolted the heavy door. For seconds of nitrogen purged to chill the emitters, then I hit the switch. I kept an eye on my watch. 30 seconds later, I cut the power. 2 seconds later, I cut the nitrogen feed. I realized that I should have stuck a little LCD camera to the bottom of a window and set up a monitor in the shop, but that was Monday morning quarterbacking at its best. I took my time unbolting the door and propping it open. That ramp seemed like a long way up. I looked outside and saw no motion. Nothing. I turned on the yard lights and waited a bit for them to ionize and fire up. I looked again in the bright orange light. I checked all 4 sides. Nothing. I counted over 35 bodies. The county commissioners were going to be pissed. The action arm of their little despotic regime was pretty well scotched. It was time for the lashback. Now I'd have to put up with the investigation, though. Crap. I might as well be proactive about it and spoil someone else's dinner. I called the state police to report the death of the entire county police force during the execution of an illegal no-knock raid. I wasn't going to hang around waiting for the questions to start. I went down to the lab to see what Lynn had whipped up for dinner. About 25 minutes later, I was complimenting Lynn on the converted biscuit idea. It had turned out great. Good. I'll add it to my recipes. No argument here. It'd probably be good over chicken stew or chili, too. While waiting for the trouble to unfold, I called the local preacher. We hadn't been close, but there were times I had helped out some members of his community when they were struggling. I explained the situation to him and suggested he write a detailed account of what had happened, naming names, adding dates, and highlighting the impact on those affected. Then I advised him to send the information to some outspoken newspapers in college and union towns to make sure this wouldn't be swept under the rug and ignored. I also recommended reaching out to the ACLU for support. I promised a substantial fund to back any legal fight that might come. By the time I hung up, I could tell he was ready to take action. Mission accomplished. The only remaining problem that I could think of was how to keep the preacher's defense fund out of the ACLU's administrative budget. I figured that the best way was not to let the money filter through their fingers where a significant fraction might stick and disappear. Before midnight, the trucks rolled into town. There was nothing overt, but it seemed military to a lot of townsfolk. The phone lines grew a little warmer. Several folk quietly headed out of town. Quite a few local television stations were called with information about the abusive seizures, then ill-advised operation against a posted microwave testing facility that had killed every man in the operation against it, and the possible military takeover of the site despite the posse comitatus laws. When asked about verification of the military's involvement, the station's informer gave a quote that went directly on the air: "If it craps like a duck and waddles like a duck, there's a pretty good chance you've got a duck." When it was discovered that the governor had panicked and declared martial law despite the fact that there was no rioting and no looting, the president got involved to cancel the edict and publicly censure the governor. It took a day and a half for anyone to get organized enough to start bagging and carrying away the bodies. The coroner remarked on the lack of decomposition. I just snorted. All their gut bacteria had been flash fried from the burst of heat that the hemolysis caused. The corpses were relatively sterile. I had the holes in my driveway filled and the gate replaced. The county didn't want to pay the bills, but the lawyer that I sicked on them rather insisted. The 10th spring, 2011. People were sure friendly in town after that. The preacher let everyone know how much I'd helped. Due to the TV station barrage, the ACLU was never called out, and nobody tried to pound on the preacher for being a snitch. Still, nobody wanted to visit me at home. Imagine that. I guess that my signs and the spinning amber light had something to do with that. Lynn became quite popular in the church. I got invited to several dinners and such. I even paid for a few pizza bashes and dance mixers. I got talked up a lot, but nobody clicked. Lynn finally talked several of the church wives and widows into helping with the harvest. We had a canning party that filled a lot of cellars that year, and we held a boiled corn dinner when the field came ripe. We filed for a festival license and closed off a block downtown for it. Oh, the city government? Forensic accounting is a wonderful thing. There wasn't a damned one of them that didn't cop a vacation at Camp Fed. The next police captain was stringently fair and invited transparency. The books were audited by the feds once every 2 years. It became an amendment to the city charter. I felt better about investing in county infrastructure without having my investments evaporate. The years after that, after looking at that denuded slope for a couple of years, I decided to do something about it. I had that valley side terrace just like I had done to my cabin site. I thought that it would look nice to have an orchard over there where I could see it. I had to patronize one of the larger nurseries in the eastern half of the state to find someone with enough stock. I started looking for my nurseryman before I even talked to my contractor, as I'd want saplings with a couple years growth on them for transplant hardiness. Now, what to plant? Cherries, apples, and pears were winter tolerant, and Thomas Jefferson grew them not too far from my homestead. But citrus wasn't hardy enough. Stone fruit could be iffy. Plums, apricots, and peaches would grow best from Georgia on south. I thought that trying to grow them in the mountains of the Virginias was asking for trouble. Traditional wisdom said a tree wouldn't bear fruit any less than 5 years from sprouting and 3 years after transplanting. Even then, the first year's fruit would be useless little marbles bearing sterile seeds. I expanded my garden a bit by plowing under some of the fallow land that I had growing in clover. I just had to keep the rows straight or else my patented miracle weed be gone, TM, would whack the wrong plants. A few 5-watt lasers attached to the mazer mounting block kept everything on the straight and narrow. I just had to keep the green dot centered on the target as I steered the tractor, dragging the plow behind. The land was tired, leached out by decades, if not centuries of runoff. The clover helped a lot, but I still felt it worthwhile to invest in chipped and decomposed brush, whatever the local arborist had on hand, that didn't come from pine or walnut trees. Once that got turned under, I felt that I had a chance of a crop. I got a few dogs to run around the place and chase off the critters. Lynn wasn't any spring chicken when she came to work for me, which made sense that she wanted to retire after a while. I'd been paying her enough to set aside a nice little nest egg to make her life comfortable when added to her Social Security benefits. Lynn introduced me to Charisse before she moved back to town. After a couple weeks, I had to look up Lynn. Lynn, you gotta help me. I'm not married to Charisse, but she damned well orders me around like I was. I'm about to lock her in the basement and spot weld the door closed. Well, that was the end of Drill Sergeant Charisse. Lynn was nice enough to keep looking for me and got the Baptist congregation involved. Beatrice, or Bree, was a plain-faced lady in her late 30s. I interviewed her at a restaurant in town. For a while there, I wondered if she was mute, but I did manage to get her to talk a little. I had to pry it out of her, but she'd been working at a county-funded babysitting agency for working parents. She'd been getting hassled by her manager and wanted out. When I saw how she was treated when I drove her over to the business office to pick up her last check, I wasn't very happy. I came back the next day to shake the manager's hand with my right hand and slap his shoulder with my left, the one wearing a glove. That was the last time he ever used that arm. Other than the hydroxyl water hole that normal microwave ovens are tuned to, nerve tissue responds to an extremely narrow microwave band. I helped her move in. Well, once I saw the quality of furniture and clothing she had, I steamrollered her into getting a new wardrobe, bed, bedding, big braided rugs and furniture on my dime. When she smiled, she was pretty. After that, I could do no wrong in her eyes. But I didn't do anything stupid. She didn't like doing the shopping, and neither did I. Her reason was she didn't like being an emotional boxing bag for some of the more vindictive bitches in town. I arranged for a home delivery service to take care of us from about 70 miles away, across the Virginia state line in Harrisonburg. They did the job without complaint and on time for the money. That was all I could ask for. She wasn't the baker that Lynn was, but she could bake bread, cobblers, jumbles, cornbread, and biscuits. We were golden. I taught her to love that Weber grill because A, the kitchen didn't need cleaning up afterwards, and B, it took a strange person to not like barbecued ribs. After that, she just ran away with it. Bree got along great with the pups and liked living in the countryside just fine. She wanted to keep a few chickens, so I had my contractor build a chicken house on the far side of the pole barn out of heavy beams to keep the critters out, and I had him fence in a half-acre of land behind the pole barn for a nice, big chicken run. The entire operation was out of sight of the cabin. I had another door put into the pole barn closest to the chicken coop and built some racks for sacks of grain, fish meal, and ground oyster shell for the birds. The only other things I had to do were put together some nesting frames, buy a few bales of hay, and provide for an outside butchering station for the birds. She knew where to get peeps, so one Saturday we drove up and down some unlabeled back roads to buy a couple flats of hatched birds. It took 3 times as long to get home as to get to the place we bought him, as they wouldn't take much of a beating and the roads were rough as a cob. After a few months, she had a regular business going, trading eggs for milk and butter with a neighbor. The quality of our table sure took an upswing. She got curious as to why I didn't have to weed the garden. I showed off my patented Miracle Weed Be Gone, TM. She was flabbergasted. I told her to let me know if she ever saw snakes or heard a rattle, and I'd take care of it. She looked at the newly weeded garden, looked at me, and nodded. Let me know so that I can get the chickens inside first. I hitched up the cart to the tractor one day and took her over to the orchard, where we walked between the groves. I took a lopper with me and cleared up a few problems as we walked. The goofy dogs kept us company as we walked. After we got back to the cabin, she just smiled and said, "Thank you, Harold." One morning, all hell broke loose. I was in the basement lab fiddling around when Bree about ran down the ramp. Harold, come quick. There's a goddamn bear in with the chickens." I sprinted the 40 yards to the pole barn, pulled the tarp off my speeder, took the key from around my neck, and started it up. After buckling myself in and gaining some height above the ground, I blasted out of the doors, circling the pole barn over the rocky ground as I approached the chicken run from the open side. I spotted the bear. Once I activated the targeting laser, it took less than 20 seconds to lock on and press the button. A precise beam traced along its body from neck to lower torso, and it collapsed like a lightning-struck tree. One bear down. I paused mid-air to steady myself, then carefully piloted my speeder back into its parking spot inside the barn. It took just a couple minutes to plug it in and secure the tarp back on with a flick of my wrists. I then walked through the barn's back door to confront Bree. "Jesus, Harold, what the hell did you do?" I grinned a little inside. It was almost word for word what Lynn asked me one day years before. I engaged the enemy and dealt him a killing blow without any collateral damage. It's the best you can hope for in any combat situation. She gawped at me for a bit, then turned to look at the fallen bear. What are we going to do with the bear, Harold? I sighed. The way I killed it really spoiled the meat for eating. All the blood turned to paste all at once. And since it won't bleed out, that's it. We can strip off the skin for a rug. But as for the meat, we'll have to chop up the carcass and use it for fertilizer. She wondered, how the hell are we going to chop up a bear carcass that weighs over half a ton? Simple, dear. A wood chipper. She laughed. She laughed like hell. Jesus, Harold, you got an answer for everything. I swear, if I ever catch you out, you're going to fall over dead. I had to rent a chipper and a backhoe. I mixed chipped wood with ground bare between the trees and between the potato hills. I cleaned up all the equipment with a steam cleaner before returning it. Some sort of neurotic forensic specialist could have found traces, but there wasn't any reason for anyone to be looking. Bree and I were sitting out back after eating a nice grilled chicken dinner, sharing a couple drinks. The sun was down and the moon had risen. The harvest moon would come soon. I asked her, is this anything like what you expected when you moved out here? Oh, hell no. To tell the truth, I was looking for a hole to climb into and pull it in after. This has been a dream come true. I'd thought long and hard about this. How would you like to make it permanent? Would you marry me, Bree? Harold, are you out of your ever-loving mind? I felt my heart sink and pass my stomach without even slowing down. I wasn't prepared for rejection. I slowly got up, turned, and headed into the cabin. I really thought that I'd had a shot at it. I really thought that I might find someone to live with. I went down into the basement and locked the door behind me. I figured that I might come out in a couple of months or so. Then again, I might not. I was feeling quite destructive after that little non-event. I began researching how big a bang I could theoretically get from a non-nuclear explosion. I had buried everything into my research. When I got that way, I often forgot to eat and sleep for long periods. Thankfully, I had a larder of canned goods and a toilet down there, or it could have gotten messy. I started with the highest energy density tolerant sample I could think of, a superconductor. Then I carefully tuned a sphere of 6 emitters to stress the molecular structures amazingly far past the point where the structures should have explosively lost coherence. But the structures reinforced each other like the lines in a buckyball. It was a goddamn big buckyball, though. I learned to form different size samples that assumed a self-referential structure, a coherence, if you will. Then I started pumping the energy density higher and higher, but it refused to catastrophically trigger. I then realized that it would take an asymmetric stimulus to destabilize it. I started probing a sample with low-powered lasers using different emission spectra to similar to a microcrystallographic analysis, working with different light frequencies to emulate the various X-ray frequencies used in crystallography. When I got a coherent structure out of my computer, I varied the charge levels of my sample to see how the molecular structures behaved. I was shocked to discover a charge level that came oh so close to a catastrophic bond shift. Then the atoms diverged as the power density increased past a narrow window. I had the cocking point. Now I needed the trigger. I couldn't go any further without a testing bunker and a really wide damage control radius. I believed that when the thing triggered, it would create a phase change throughout the sample within a picosecond or less. I made sure all my notes were duplicated, took a drink of water, and fell over sideways into my bunk. I awoke to a relentless hammering against the basement access door. I realized that I'd never get back to sleep with all that racket, so I undogged the thing and threw it open. There stood Bree with an axe handle in her hands, beaten until it splintered. She threw it to the floor and screeched, "God damned it, Harold. Get your butt up here and sit down so's I can yell at you." Oh, she was red-faced and spitting mad. Oh, Jesus. Suddenly, locking myself up in the basement again didn't seem like a bad idea. Boy, I got the riot act read to me left, right, and up the middle. As she started to slow down, I found myself instinctively saying yes, dear, and of course, dear. She finally ran out of steam, blinked twice, started bawling, and threw herself into my lap. I couldn't think of a damn thing to but hold her with one arm and pet her hair and back with the other. She slowed down to an occasional sniff, then said, "God damned it, Harold. You smell like a goat farm. You need a bath." How long was I down there? Almost 3 weeks. Don't you remember? Bree, when I get deep into research like that, you could make a loud noise right next to me, and I wouldn't notice unless you moved my keyboard and monitor. After we were married and had a honeymoon in Fiji, I contacted the Air Force Weapons Development Group in Kirtland, New Mexico. I'd already proven my bona fides with my patents, and I got pipelined to one of their explosives development teams. When I duplicated my experiment in their shop, most of the team hyperventilated and took medical leave. Only a couple old-school guys that came from the old projects on enhanced radiation devices seemed really interested. When I hypothesized the phase change model for energy release, they got real still for a while, then called a few phone numbers. Now, I don't know German for beans, but when someone made me sign a hell of a lot of papers and assigned me to Project Gotterdaming, I got the idea. Rather than hit the sample with X-rays, lasers, EM bursts, or any other raw energy forms which I figured would just be absorbed by the stress structure and knock it out of the bond shift window, I wanted to try a mechanical solution. They shrugged and said, "What the hell?" It worked for little boy. First, we charged up a sample until it was inside our desired window, then cut the power to see how long it would cohere before losing too much energy to the environment. We guesstimated a slight overcharge would work while a pair of small explosive charges whacked the specimens into each other at about 60 meters per second. Then we created a doubled experiment with 2 charged samples of equal mass. These were relatively cheap experiments to create, but they were flown up outside of geostationary orbit to try, which comprised our major budget hits. Luckily, our first concussive release experiment succeeded. We couldn't find any way to contain or control the release. The energy discharge caused millions of dollars in damage to shipping near the equatorial Atlantic Ocean. The intense X-rays and ultraviolet radiation led to the loss of most of the sea crews within a wide area beneath the release point. The surface ecosystem suffered severe damage. The black body radiation created a superheated pocket of unstable air that disrupted the local weather patterns. The thunderclap from the rapidly heated air circled the globe at least once. I took a philosophical view and told the team it was fortunate we didn't set it off inside a bunker at Kirtland. The resulting damage would have affected all of California and stretched from central Canada down to Mexico City. It might have even triggered a nuclear winter. All that from a device the size of a footlocker. I figured that I couldn't do much better than that, so I changed hobbies. I started playing the guitar. I figured that I couldn't cause near as much damage with just a stringed instrument. After listening to me practice for a couple of months, Bree begged to differ. She asked for a raise, claiming battlefield conditions and psychological warfare. When the chickens ran away and hid, it hurt, you know? It really hurt. Sometimes a guy can't get no respect. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.